Okay, so the problem that we faced last time was that if we keep our code in here, it keeps updating the like it keeps creating the asteroid over and over again, and that creates a complete mess. So we need to somehow like restrict the amount of asteroid we want to spawn, right? So there is a like tons of way of doing it. The easiest way of doing it is to use something called invoke. So I'm going to delete all this script. I'm going to basically not delete them, keep them, because we are going to need them just in a bit. But let's talk about invoke first. So invoke, if when we are trying to use this invoke, before we actually use it, we need to know something called methods. Because as you can see, if I use invoke, it expects a method and a time. So what does invoke do and what is a method? Let's talk about that first. So we have been using methods since our first coding exercise, right? So we have been using it all along, but we have not officially talked about them. Methods are basically a bunch of script combined together in a particular area. So for example, if we do void update here, we can write code inside these curly braces, right? Like we did in the start curly brace, ending curly brace, and inside there we have added a bunch of script. Now what Unity does, Unity automatically calls start, and everything inside starts run automatically. Let's take one example. I am going to create just like this method. I'm going to copy this, paste it here. I'm going to name it something else. um, Maybe we're going to name it spawn. So a method has a few things. The naming convention is same as variables. You cannot use a number in front of a method. For example, you cannot do something like this is not allowed, right? You cannot use a special character, something like this. So the naming conventions are just like variables. Okay, so it should have a name, a return type, and some arguments. So what are those? First of all, name. For our case, the name of our method is spawn. Return type, currently the return type is void. That means it's not returning anything. I'm going to talk about what a return type means just in a bit. And finally, arguments are things that goes inside this bracket. Okay, so currently nothing in here. So the arguments are 0, no argument. Return type for our case is void, no return type. Let's check another one. We are going to create a method that returns the health of the player. Okay, so I'm just going to do int health, something like this. So now the name is health, the return type is int, and finally there is no argument. Okay, and when we do return type, we need to make sure our functions or our method's body returns some value that is basically the same data type. For example, we could do something like int h equal 10, and maybe we do some calculation. Maybe we take a health if the player gets hit or something, and then we return h. So these are the things that we have learned. We have talked about how we define methods. Methods are defined by, first of all, a name, a return type, and some argument. Both of this method doesn't have any argument, so it's zero argument method. Then if we have a return type, that means we need to return some value to the method. Now when we are talking about returning, that means basically we could do something like this here. We could do int h equal health. Now when you do this, you can actually take whatever the value of h was and put it inside this temporary variable h, right? But you cannot do the same for spawn. For example, if I try to do something like int h equal spawn, that's not allowed, right? That's not allowed because spawn does not return any value, so you cannot store it somewhere, or you cannot get any value, right, from that particular method. So that's the main difference between having a return type or no return type. Okay, so now let's talk about arguments. So let's take another example. I'm going to do damage. Okay, so maybe we want to create a method that that just do some damage to the player, right? So we want to create a variable player. So we can do p we can do something with that, right? So p dot health or something like that. Maybe I'm just going to do damage value, right? So in here, when we come in here, we just do maybe health minus equal d, something like this, and then we return the d. Okay, so yeah, these examples doesn't make much sense because I am just making this up, but the goal here is not to make sense of the method. The goal is to actually know how you define methods. Okay, so we are going to show you just an actual example just in a bit. So I'm just going to delete all this, and we are going to work on this spawn method and see why this is significant, why we even need a method. So as you can see, there is a lot of code that we already have written here, right? So if we keep writing code in this manner, then our code is going to be unreadable just after a few days. So we need to somehow combine them into different methods so that they kind of keeps organized. So that is why we're going to copy all this. We're not going to use it here, and we're going to put that in the spawn. So what does this do now? Wherever I call this spawn, everything that goes inside this method will be executed, right? So now if I run this game, it's going to do the exact same thing before it was doing, right? So nothing has changed. Only thing that got changed is that we have kept our code a little bit modular, so it's now more clean. Now, the purpose of this tutorial was to repeat this thing or talk about invoke. So let's talk about invoke now. Now, this is one way of calling this method. We call this method, it gets executed like just that moment, right? So when you start the game, it gets called and it executed itself. But invoke has this capability to call a method in a particular second, right? So you can basically for example, call the method after 5 seconds, not at the same time when you start the game. Maybe after 5 seconds you want to invoke the method, you could do that, right? So that is what invoke does. So if I just do invoke, the method I'm going to invoke is a spawn. So I'm going to do spawn, and then I'm going to say 5 seconds, and let's comment this out, go back to Unity, and as you can see, we're just waiting, nothing is happening yet, but now it's happened because 5 seconds has like 5 seconds is done, then the spawn method was called. So what else could we do with invoke? There is another one called invoke repeating, right? Invoke repeating. Invoke repeating is another method which basically does the same thing, but it has one more exciting part, which is a repeat rate. So like how much you want to do you want to call this method again? Do you want to keep calling this method? If you want to do it, then you could use invoke repeating, right? So for our case, we want to keep calling this method after a few seconds, so we're going to use it. I'm going to say invoke repeating and then the name of the method, and the next parameter is when you want to start calling the method. I want to start it right away, so it's 0. And then repeat rate, how like how often do you want to repeat? So I want to repeat it in every 1 second, just for example. Okay, and now if I save, go back to Unity, now you can see we are getting some asteroids in every 1 second, right? Pretty cool. So what is next? The next thing that we want to do is to spawn these asteroids in a random locations, right? So currently all of them are spawning in the same locations in here, but we want to spawn it randomly in many different places here. So how can we do this? We could do this simply by adding a new randomness in here. So let's do this. I am going to do int randx. Now what should be the range? The range should be from here to here. So how can we get that value? Again, just like we did the other stuff, if I click on the spawner, I can move it in the left corner, that is -10, and this is +10. So let's make it something around -8 to +8. So -8 +8, right? And rather than instantiating this in the position, we are going to add this random x. So I'm going to add new vector3 randx. I hope it makes sense to you guys, right? So we are just adding up the random x, so it gives us some offsets. So for example, the by default the asteroids will spawn in here, right? And then we are going to add some random value. So the random value can be minus something or plus something, right? So for example, if the value is -4, then we move it a little bit left. If the value is +4, then we move it a little bit right. Okay, so I'm going to move it in the center. Oh, sorry. Yeah, in the center here. This is 5. Yeah, or maybe a little bit up. That also works. So yeah, so what happens is that it adds up that particular value with 0 now, right? So 0 +8 -8. I hope it makes sense. Anyways, so yeah, I'm going to do the same for all the other coding parts. Awesome. So yeah, now if we save and play the game, things will get interesting. As you can see, now we are getting asteroid from many different places, right? Awesome. So yeah, next thing that we want to do is simply we're going to stop the lecture for this part here. Next part, we are going to add some collision, so they collide with each other, and the bullet can basically destroy the asteroid, and the asteroid can also do some damage to our player. Okay, I'll see you in the next lecture.